The lights went out at 6:15 on a Thursday evening in November. Not a power outage. Power outages have a particular quality. The whole neighborhood goes dark together. The hum you never notice, the refrigerator, the furnace, the electrical breathing of a house that is alive, all of it stops at once, and the silence is communal. This was different. This was only my house. The street outside was lit. My neighbor Dorothy's porch light was on. The house across the road had their television flickering blue. The entire neighborhood exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago. Only my house was dark and cold. The furnace had stopped too. November in Ohio. Outside temperature 41 degrees and dropping. Inside temperature falling to match it with the efficiency of a house that has no heat and that the cold enters through every gap and edge. I stood in my kitchen in the dark. I had been expecting this. My son Richard had been building toward it for 3 months. It had started with suggestions. Mom, this house is too big. Mom, the maintenance must be overwhelming. Mom, at your age, he always said at your age, a continuing care community might offer so much more. He brought brochures, glossy ones, meadow pines, photographs of elderly people doing yoga and looking peaceful in the staged way that people in brochures look peaceful. I read them. I said, Richard, I am not going to Meadow Pines. He said, you are being stubborn. I said, I am being clear. There is a difference. He came back with a spreadsheet. The house costs money to run, he said. The numbers were organized. The conclusion was predetermined. He said the house could be sold. I said, this house was purchased in 1987 by your father and me, paid off in 2003, left to me when Robert died in 2019. I live in it. I maintain it. I am not selling it. He came a third time with a man named Gerald Whitmore, estate planning consultant, expensive shoes, smooth energy. He explained in careful, patient language that liquidating residential assets in advance of care placement was a sound financial strategy. I poured him tea. I said, Mr. Whitmore, I ran Jefferson High School for 29 years. I have listened to approximately 4,000 people attempt to manage a situation by dressing it in professional language. You are telling me to sell my house so my son can access the proceeds. That is what you are telling me. Gerald Whitmore looked at Richard. Richard looked at the table. They left. After that visit, I understood that language had failed Richard's plan. What was coming next would not be words, utilities. That was what I expected. The practical infrastructure of a house. A house without utilities becomes uninhabitable in November within hours. Uninhabitable creates crisis. Crisis creates pressure. And pressure on a 74-year-old woman alone in the dark was what my son apparently believed would accomplish what the brochures and spreadsheets and Gerald Whitmore had not. He was wrong. But I let him try. I stood in my dark kitchen for approximately 2 minutes. Then I went to my bedroom. Phone flashlight on. I opened the cedar chest. Robert's blanket. Heavy. Warm. The particular weight of something made with care. I took my pillow, the flannel sheet from the linen closet, my wool coat, my warmest gloves, my hat. I also took a folder. It had been sitting in the bottom drawer of my dresser for 2 months, prepared with my attorney the week I understood where Richard was heading. I will tell you what was inside it shortly. I called a taxi. The driver looked at my bag. At the blanket visible above the top, he said, Ma'am, are you all right? I said, I am going to the Millbrook Grand Hotel. My son is having a dinner party, and I was not invited, but the situation warrants my attendance. He nodded the nod of a man who has learned not to question the urgency certain passengers carry. Now I need to tell you about Richard's dinner. Richard was 46 years old, senior partner at Callaway & Associates, a commercial real estate firm he had built over 15 years. Tonight was the annual client dinner. 40 people, major clients, prospective investors, the most important business evening of his year. He had been planning it for 6 weeks. He had not invited me. He had assumed I would be in the dark and cold, discovering the utilities were cut, and that calling him in distress was the natural next step, and that the distress would create the opening for Meadow Pines that all previous approaches had failed to produce. He assumed incorrectly. The hotel lobby was warm. I went to the front desk. I said, "My name is Margaret Calloway. I believe there is an event tonight in the Birchwood Room for Calloway and Associates." The young woman checked. She said, "Yes, ma'am. Are you on the guest list?" I said, "I am the mother of the host. I have been experiencing a utilities issue at my home tonight. I need to speak with my son." She looked at the blanket. She said, "Of course, ma'am. Let me take you up." She walked me to the Birchwood Room. She knocked. She opened the door. 40 people, round tables with white linens, candles, the warm buzz of a successful dinner at the comfortable end of the main course. Richard was at the head table, speaking with the man to his right, James Harrington, managing director of Richard's largest client relationship. I recognized him from the firm's website. Richard saw me. The color left his face. Immediately. Completely. One moment the color of a man at the height of his professional evening. The next, the color of a man watching the consequence of a decision arrive in a doorway carrying a blanket and a pillow. Heads turned. I walked in. Not rushing, the pace of a woman who has arrived somewhere she has every right to be. I set my bag on the empty chair beside Richard, the blanket visible, the pillow visible. He said, "Mom," his voice low. "What are you doing here?" I said, "Richard, my utilities were disconnected this evening. My house has no electricity and no heat. It is November. I could not stay." He said, "We can talk about this later." I said, "I do not have a later tonight. I have tonight." James Harrington said to Richard, "Is everything all right?" Richard said, "Yes. Small issue at my mother's house." He looked at me with pleading eyes. The particular look of a man asking a woman to be smaller than the situation requires. I looked back at him. I had run a school for 29 years. I had looked at 10,000 faces and learned to read what was behind them. I knew what was behind Richard's face. Fear of what I was about to say, of what this room was about to learn. He was right to be afraid, not because I had come to humiliate him. I had come because my house was dark and cold, and he had made it dark and cold, and the making of it was a fact that the world was going to understand whether he preferred it to or not. I sat down. I reached into my bag. I took out the folder. James Harrington was watching. The table was watching. 40 people paying peripheral attention while pretending not to. I said to James Harrington, "I am Margaret Calloway, Richard's mother. I apologize for interrupting. I would not have come if I had somewhere else to go. My son disconnected the utilities to my home this evening, November in Ohio. No heat, no electricity. I am 74 years old, and my son is in this hotel." James Harrington looked at Richard. Richard said, "It is a misunderstanding." He said, "Mom, please." I said, "It is not a misunderstanding, Richard." The utility company confirmed this afternoon when I called that both accounts were suspended at the request of the account holder. You are the account holder. You took over management of both utilities after your father died as a convenience to me. A convenience which has been used for a purpose it was not intended for. The table was quiet. Richard said, "This is not the place, Mom." I said, "Richard, my living room was the place. My kitchen table was the place. You were in those places 3 times in 3 months, and those were the places where I told you clearly that I was not going to Meadow Pines. Those were the places where we could have resolved this as a mother and son who disagree about something important. You chose this place when you cut my utilities tonight. I simply arrived at the location you selected." James Harrington said, "Did you disconnect your mother's utilities?" Richard said, "James." "I can explain." James said, "Please do." Richard looked at me, at the folder, at 40 people, at James Harrington, whose investment relationship was worth $4 million annually to the firm. He looked at the blanket. He said, "There has been concern about my mother managing the property independently. We have been discussing transitioning her to a care facility. The utilities situation was—" He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. The words that accurately completed it were not words any son wanted to say about himself in front of 40 clients and investors and James Harrington. James finished it for him. He said the utilities situation was designed to force her hand. Richard said nothing. James looked at me. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, what is in the folder?" I opened it. I said the folder contains documents relating to my property at 44 Birchwood Lane, the original deed from 1987, the mortgage payoff from 2003. Robert's death certificate, the probate filing transferring ownership to me, the current tax assessment, the current insurance in my name. I said it also contains this. I took out the last document, 1 page, prepared with my attorney 2 months ago when I understood where Richard's campaign was heading. I said this is a legal declaration of residential intent. Recorded with the county 6 weeks ago, it states that I am a legally competent adult who intends to remain in my primary residence and who has not authorized any family member to take action designed to compel her departure from it. My attorney has a copy, the county has a copy, I have this copy. I slid it across to James Harrington. He read it. He set it down. He looked at Richard for a long moment. He said, "Richard, I have done business with Callaway and Associates for 11 years. I have referred your firm to 14 of my colleagues. Those referrals were based on my assessment of your character, your judgment, the kind of man you were." He paused. He said, "I need to revise that assessment." The room was completely silent, not polite silence between courses. The weighted silence of 40 people sitting inside a moment that has revealed something about a man they believed they knew. Richard looked at the white linen, at the candle, at the place where Gerald Whitmore's spreadsheet had seemed so reasonable, and the numbers so tidy, and the plan so manageable. He looked at his mother. He said, "Mom, I am sorry." I looked at my son. I said, "Richard, I know you are. I know what you did came from somewhere that was not entirely malicious. I know you told yourself a story, that you were concerned, that the house was too much, that Meadow Pines was the responsible choice. I know you have been telling yourself that story for 3 months. I said, "But Richard," somewhere inside the story was something else, something that knew the house had appreciated, something that was not entirely about my well-being. He said nothing. I said, "You do not need to confirm it. I am not asking for a confession in front of 40 people. I am telling you that I know, the way mothers know, the way I have always known the things you did not tell me." I said, "Here is what happens tonight. You call the utility company and have services restored. Tonight, not tomorrow. In the meantime, the hotel will provide me with a room, because that is what hotels do, and I have already confirmed availability at the front desk." I said, "Tomorrow morning you come to my house, without Gerald Whitmore, without spreadsheets, just you, and we have the honest conversation, the real one, between a mother and a son." He looked at me with Robert's eyes, the gray that Robert had and that Richard inherited, and that I had been looking at for 46 years. He said, "Yes, Mom, I will come." I stood up. I took my bag, left the folder on the table. I said to James Harrington, "Thank you for listening. I am sorry for the interruption." He said, "Mrs. Callaway, in 35 years in business, I have learned that the character of a firm is determined not by how it operates in public, but by how the people inside it operate when they believe nobody important is watching." He looked at Richard. He said, "Your mother was watching." I said, "Good night, Mr. Harrington." I walked out. The hotel gave me a room on the 3rd floor. Warm, a real bed. I laid Robert's blanket on top, not because I needed it, because it was mine, and I had brought it. I sat on the bed. I was not angry. I want to say that clearly because it is true. Anger at your children is the easiest emotion and the least useful one. What I felt was more complicated. The grief of a woman who has raised a son for 46 years and who has watched him do something that revealed a place in him where her pride did not reach, a place where something smaller than love had been living. That place could be addressed. That was what tomorrow was for. The utilities at my house were restored at 9:47. Dorothy texted me. She said the lights came on, and she had seen Richard's car in my driveway for 20 minutes before the utility truck arrived, and he had been sitting in it the way a man sits when he is doing something difficult and necessary and long overdue. Richard came to my house the next morning at 8:30. No spreadsheet, no brochures, no Gerald Whitmore, just my son, in my kitchen. Robert's eyes, looking at me across the table I had been sitting at since 1987. He said, "Mom, I want to tell you what was actually true, about why I was pushing." I said, "I am listening." He said there were 2 things. One I told myself, one I did not. I said, "Tell me both." He said the one I told myself was that I was worried. that the house was too much, that you were alone and the winters were long, and I was 45 minutes away, and if something happened, I said that part was real, Richard. I know. He said the part I did not tell myself. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, Dad left the house to you. I knew that was right. But there was a part of me, a small part, that had been thinking about what the house would be worth when... He could not finish. I said when I was gone. He said yes. The kitchen was quiet. I said, Richard, I am going to tell you something your father told me the year before he died. He was sitting in that chair. He said, Margaret, when I am gone, the house is yours as long as you want it, and when you are done with it, it passes to Richard. That was always the plan. The house was always coming to you, through time, through the natural order. You did not need to accelerate it. He looked at the table. I said the acceleration was the problem, not the wanting. Wanting what your parents built is human. I do not fault you for it. The utilities, Gerald Whitmore, the pressure. That was the problem. He said, I know. I said, do you? He said, yes, Mom, I know. I said, tomorrow, you call Gerald Whitmore and tell him his services are not required. You shred the spreadsheet. He said, already done. Last night from the parking lot. I said, good. He said, James Harrington called me this morning. I said, what did he say? He said he is not withdrawing from the firm. He said something I want to tell you. He said a man who will do what I did to his mother will eventually do something similar to a client when the pressure is high enough. He said he was not withdrawing because he believed I was capable of being better than what he saw last night, but he was going to be watching. He looked at me. He said you both said the same thing. You said you know because mothers know. He said I am going to be watching. I said, Richard, the people who love you and the people who depend on you are always watching. Not to catch you, to know you. James watches to know whether his trust is sound. I watch because you are my son, and watching you is what I have been doing for 46 years, and it is the one job I will never retire from, he said, Mom. I am glad you came last night. I said I had nowhere else to go. The plain truth said plainly, landing differently than the same truth dressed in something softer. He sat with it. Then he said, can I help with anything around the house today? The gutters. I said the gutters can wait. I stood up. I went to the stove. I said, have you eaten breakfast? He said, no. I said, sit down. I made eggs, scrambled, with the particular unhurried attention eggs require. Toast from the bakery on Morrison Street. Orange juice. Coffee strong the way Robert had liked it and Richard had inherited the liking. I set the plate in front of him. He said, Mom. Thank you. I sat across from him at my kitchen table. In my house. Heat working. Lights on. The November morning coming through the window above the sink the way November morning comes through that window. Low and golden, and not warm but present. We sat in that kitchen for 2 hours. Not talking about Meadow Pines. Not talking about spreadsheets or Gerald Whitmore. Talking about Robert. About the years, about the things that accumulate in a kitchen where a family has been living and eating and arguing and forgiving for 37 years. The things that are not on any spreadsheet, the things that are worth staying for. What I want to say to every woman watching today is something Robert said to me in this kitchen 23 years ago. He said, Margaret, the house is not the point. I said, Robert, we just paid it off. The house is extremely the point. He laughed. He said, the house is where the point lives. He said, you are what is worth staying for. He said, the house is the container. You are the point. I said, Robert, that is very poetic for a man who just unclogged the kitchen drain. He said, I contain multitudes, Margaret. I looked at Richard finishing his eggs. At the window, at the November light. I said, Robert, to the empty chair, to the man 5 years gone who was at every table where anything that mattered happened. I said, you were right. As usual. Richard looked up. He said, did you say something? I said, eat your toast. It is getting cold. He smiled. His father's smile. He ate his toast. What I want to say to every woman watching today is this. Your house is not the point. You are the point. And a son who looks at the walls and sees value instead of looking at the woman and seeing his mother, That son is not lost. He is confused. He has mistaken the container for what is inside it. The correction for that confusion is not anger, and it is not a lawyer, and it is not a shouting match. It is arriving at his most important dinner with your blanket and your pillow and your folder full of documents, sitting down at his table, letting the room understand what he almost did, and then making him breakfast in the morning. Because that is what mothers do. We arrive where we are not expected. We say the true thing where it needs to be said, and then we make breakfast. Because the breakfast is also the point. Tell me in the comments, has a child ever treated you like a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be honored? Has someone used your age as a reason to take what you built? Has someone ever made you feel like the house was worth more than the person living in it? Tell me what you did, because I think there are women watching today sitting in houses someone wants to take from them, being told very politely and very reasonably that leaving would be better for everyone. Stay, pack your blanket if you have to, walk through whatever door needs walking through, and let the room understand what it is looking at. A woman who built something, who is not finished, who is not going anywhere,